Every time he touches me, it feels like all he wants is sex. Probably. So what? Your man is attracted to you. Stop being upset about it.
What do you think? Is there a connection between this video of a Muslim woman who speaks in the name of Islam about marriage, in which she relates with mockery or contempt, or so I interpret it, to the subjective experience of a woman who perhaps needs other emotional needs met before she sleeps with her husband, and the fact that the countries where women have the fewest rights of all countries in the world are Muslim countries like Iran, Pakistan, Sudan, and Algeria? Is there a connection between the statement of the woman in the video and the fact that most cases of femicide in Israeli society are carried out within Arab communities? Is there a connection between her statement and the fact that most prisoners in France, country with a Christian majority, are Muslim, and the fact that in Sweden most of those convicted of rape are Muslims, while Muslims constitute only 10% of the general population? In other words, is Muslim culture as a whole a culture that relates to women in a different way than the Western and Jewish cultures relate to them? In the Quran and the Hadith, we can find all sorts of statements toward women that would sound shocking to us, but the critical viewer could argue that the Torah also contains statements that would sound utterly unacceptable to the modern ear. Moreover, if you read interpretations by religious scholars of Islam, you can find explanations that justify the verses in relation to their period and interpret them in a way that sounds more reasonable to the modern ear. Furthermore, according to Islam, and this is not a revisionist reading, but a traditional reading of the text, there is a measure of reciprocity in the demand to satisfy sexual desire. Men too are obligated to attend to the women's needs and even to engage in foreplay. So, my argument will not rely solely on verses from Islamic sources as an explanation for the deficient culture that is spreading among Muslims and, unfortunately, expanding into Europe as well, because one must also understand the context of these verses and the historical background. But the bottom line is, yes, I am going to argue that the statement of the Muslim woman who gives marriage advice on TikTok based on Islam is not her personal opinion and not a misinterpretation of Islam. Rather, it reflects mainstream Islam and the essential and central message of Islam. First, according to the Hadith, the Islamic compilation of religious law, a woman is obligated to respond to her husband's call for intimacy unless she has a good excuse: menstruation, illness, or extreme exhaustion. If a man calls his wife to bed, it is written, and she refuses without giving a good reason, the angels will curse her until morning. And as mentioned, there is also an obligation on the man to satisfy the woman, but in Islam there is a clear hierarchy. The man has the final word, and therefore disobedience on the woman's part is unacceptable. The Quran states, as for the women from whom you fear rebellion, first advise them, then abandon them in bed, and finally strike them. Likewise, according to Islam, polygamy, one man with several women, up to four according to the Hadith, is permitted. And polygamy necessarily harms women's rights. First, because instead of partnership between the man and the woman has to compete for the man with other women. Second, a 2012 meta-analysis found that women in polygamous marriages suffer from significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, anger, psychosis, and mental health problems. They report lower marital satisfaction, low self-esteem, and difficulty in parenting. In addition, they suffer from second wife syndrome, chronic jealousy, quarrels, and violence among the women themselves. In general, polygamy is associated with higher rates of violence toward women and children. And it's true that Judaism originally did not prohibit polygamy either, so of course one must understand the source of the laws in their historical context, and there is no doubt that a married woman, even if her husband had other wives, was better off than remaining unmarried in the period when the laws were written. But while in Judaism an explicit prohibition against polygamy was issued as early as the 11th century, and even before that marrying more than one woman mostly occurred under special circumstances such as infertility or levirate marriage, and there was explicit criticism toward King Solomon for his pursuit of women, in Islam, these laws have remained in place and have not been amended over the years. Therefore, as I said, we are not referring only to the sources, but also to what is actually happening in reality. The sources are simply a way to connect the reality in Muslim culture today with the religion of Islam. And in practice today, polygamy is still a prevalent practice in Muslim societies. It should be said only 2% of the world population lives in polygamous households, but the countries with the highest rates of polygamy are Muslim, particularly the Belt countries in Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Gambia, all Muslim countries where the rate of polygamous households ranges between 28 and 36%. And when non-Muslim households are excluded, the polygamy rate rises even higher. And what about Christianity? Why is there no polygamy in Europe and the West in general, which is based on Judeo-Christian values? Why does the West lead in freedom for its citizens while Islam ranks at the bottom of civil rights indices, particularly women's rights? Well, first, the West is the exception relative to the world, and even in the West, this process of increasing freedom for citizens, men and women, took place over thousands of years. But this process became possible first and foremost because Christianity was not political to begin with. Christianity began as a small Jewish sect under Roman rule, and over the next 300 years, despite persecution and blood libels, Christianity grew from about 1,000 believers in the year 40 CE to 200,000 in 200 CE and to 3 to 6 million in 300 CE, making the Christian population 5 to 10% of the Roman Empire. At a certain point, Rome declared full religious tolerance, which paved the way for Christianity toward dominance over paganism and other religions. But the foundational principle in Christianity of the separation between Caesar and God always remained. Therefore, although Christianity is more popular than Islam and has reached more people, it never had the political ambitions that Islam had. Islam, on the other hand, did not experience 300 years of suppression at the start of its journey, but rather the exact opposite. It spread from its inception like wildfire because Muhammad, unlike Jesus, who was sort of a pacifist, was a warrior and a conqueror, and within just 20 years had established a state. Therefore, in Islam, there was never a need to separate religion from state. Muhammad founded a single religion state whose constitution was the Quran. Islam, in this sense, is completely different from Christianity. While Christianity is first and foremost a personal religion, Islam is essentially an entire system of religion and state together. But unlike civil laws as in Christian countries, laws that are obviously the product of human beings and therefore can be changed, the laws of Sharia, the Islamic law, are the word of God and therefore eternal and unchangeable. And this is the root of the reason that Muslim countries are still stuck in a patriarchal culture as it was 1300 years ago, while in the West, laws are updated and changed in accordance with social and technological changes that allow people to attain more freedom. Moreover, the message of Judaism, from which the West largely grew, is the message of freedom, the message of free choice, including the choice of whether to believe in God or not. Whereas Islam is a religion of submission, that is the literal meaning of the word Islam. There is no place for dialogue and wrestling with God as in Judaism. One must submit to God, and therefore, to this day, Muslims do not accept the laws of the countries they live in. For example, in France, Muslims constitute 8 to 10% of the population, but they constitute 50 to 70% of prisoners. In Sweden, immigrants and descendants of immigrants, most of whom are Muslim, constitute 11% of the population, but their share among those convicted of rape and attempted rape stands at 63%. In Israel, too, out of 252 murders in 2025, more than 80% of these cases occurred in Arab society, which constitutes only 21% of the general population. So yes, there is a connection between statements that dismiss the subjective world of the woman and Muslim culture as a whole. It stems from both the fact that Islam has not been updated since its founding in the 7th century, and it is also the fact that from the outset its laws were more discriminatory towards women than Jewish laws. What I'm trying to say is that in the case of Islam, this attitude towards women is not a bug and it does not stem from a misunderstanding of the text. The evidence shows unambiguously, both from Muslim countries and from Muslim communities living in Western countries, that Islam simply perceives the woman as inferior to the man as far as her individual rights are concerned. She has less authority, less autonomy, and less freedom. Therefore, one needs to thoroughly understand what stands behind the statements of this Muslim marriage mentor. Is it a good thing that a husband is attracted to his wife? Obviously. And that the fact that the man is interested in sex with his wife without talking to her beforehand or attending to her emotional needs necessarily mean that he is objectifying her? No. For many men, the way they know how to give love to their woman most effectively is through touch. Obviously, sometimes there is also an issue of objectification in sexuality, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a man who loves his wife and where there is simply a gap between the way he knows how to give love and the way this woman needs to receive it. And many times, when women understand this, it becomes easier for them to respond to their husband's invitation to physical intimacy because they stop seeing this invitation as objectification of them. But this is not what this mentor is saying. She simply dismisses the woman's frustration offhandedly, and I think there is good reason to believe that she takes this approach because, according to the Islamic conception, the subjective experience of the woman is simply less important than that of the man. Thank you for watching.